This project represents the work of Rachel, whom you've met, and also Mark Vinson and Karine Al-Hajanian, who couldn't be with us today. Taarof, I guess there's many ways of expressing what it is. We just thought for now we can call it ways that Persian speakers express etiquette. And I do invite you, if you have any questions or comments about what I'm going to talk about, you can interrupt me. We've been working on Taarof here at CASL since 2013. We have a larger delivery order called Plans and Intentions, where we're trying to read between the lines. I think in the higher levels of ILR language competency, that is known to be or thought to be an important skill. Things that people say that they don't necessarily express, or things that people say that don't necessarily mean literally what they said. And in that period, we developed a literature review. There's a lot that's been written about Taarof, both in Persian and in English. We focused a lot. There have been several dissertations written about Taarof. There was, particularly when Americans were in Iran until the late 70s, a lot of dissertations seemed to emerge from that period. We've written 2 technical reports. Section 1 is kind of brief, and Section 2 is fully elaborate detail. So if you're interested, let me know, and I can send you a copy of that report. This year, we've been focusing on creating materials that ADET can use to offer a course for Taarof. And they're thinking of doing 2 courses, one that would be an English introduction to the concept for introductory Persian students, and the other would be with full linguistic Persian details for advanced students. So this presentation is really meant to familiarize you. You are obviously much more familiar with Taarof probably than most people. It's not necessarily a course, but just kind of an overview to kind of get input from you about the kinds of things that you think in your experience that it would be important to communicate in a class. So what is Taarof? One way of looking at it is that it's ritualized, indirect conversation used by speakers of Persian. What I mean by indirect is if I tell you directly, you're an idiot or something. If I want to say indirectly, I could say, well, I guess there's lots of ways we could think of to express that, to express our dissatisfaction with people, for example, that don't necessarily say it directly. Or if someone wants to go to the airport and we don't feel like driving them, there's different ways we might express that rather than just say, I don't want to take you to the airport. Or maybe I've got something else to do, whether that's true or not. So all cultures use indirectness in different ways. But the fact about Persian is it may be more ritualized. That is, there's certain rituals, going through a door, paying for a bill, making a compliment that Persian speakers engage in. And the reason we're even caring about this is because, A, it may be inscrutable to the non-Persian, the non-Iranian, the non-Afghan who's not familiar with what's really going on here. And we can learn a lot about the relationship between the people if we study these interactions. So Taarof is characterized by occasionally lengthy ritualized exchanges. The ahval porsi, how's your mother, father, sister, brother, all these different people. Things that you almost are required to do by the culture. And if you don't do them, you may be seen as aberrant in some way or impolite. And so it's figurative language. That is not necessarily language that would have a literal meaning that would make sense, where people offer themselves as sacrifices, call themselves slaves, or call listeners masters. So now in this age when slavery is banned, hopefully throughout the world, obviously these things are not meant literally, but we're trying to explore what they do mean. What is the purpose of Taarof? Taarof is probably very old. Some of the things we read imply that it came, from pre-Islamic culture and so on. And many traditional cultures throughout the world have similar rituals. So it's not unique to Persian. In Japanese and Chinese, there are different ritualistic formats. But I think that it's particularly salient in Taarof to the extent that in many articles we read about the nuclear negotiations and other stories about Iran, this topic comes up. So it's obviously very salient. One of its purposes for the people who use it might be to indicate the relative social standing of the people. Whether, I'm talking to my boss, or I'm talking to my child, or I'm talking to my peer, those things that come out by an analysis of what we're calling Taarof, largely speaking. Other terms we've heard are phatic communion. Phatic refers to things that come out of your mouth, and a communion, so when we talk to strangers about the weather, things like that, small talk, those are examples of phatic communion in English. Or social lubricant. If we have to say something to get started, that might make it easier rather than having to break the ice, as we in our culture, where we don't necessarily have to talk to strangers. So it might be a little harder for us. And one other thing we read about was getting the lower hand. We think about getting the upper hand in our own dealings, but it seems to be in Persian it's often, oh no, you're better, you do it, you go first, things like that. So somehow a struggle to be, on the bottom, which seems strange from an American perspective. And obviously, so there's no word Taarof, that's why we're using the Persian word, but people have called it ritual courtesy, communicative routine, ritual politeness, and polite verbal wrestling. Why is Taarof important? Well, at least for the language learner or user, it can provide critical information about the relative social standing of language users. So that could be as simple as who says shoma and who says to, whether it's symmetrical or not. And it's also important to understand because attention to the literal meaning about slaves and sacrifices could obscure what's really going on or mislead. And non-native speakers of Persian would naively conclude that Taarof is insincerity or even hypocrisy. Sometimes people really want you to stay over or really want to pay for your meal or offer you a glass of tea. So we can't assume that Taarof is all insincere. It's just a way of expressing the same kinds of positive and negative emotions people in any culture might want to express. So one of the theoretical frameworks we found useful to think about Taarof is something called linguistic politeness. So you may hear things like, oh, the Japanese are very polite, or the British are very polite. What does that mean? There's two ways of being polite, I think. One is linguistically polite, saying please and thank you, and the other is to really show respect for other people. So this isn't necessarily about that. So when we're talking about polite, in this context, we're talking about something called linguistic politeness, which doesn't really have to do with your inherent goodness or niceness as a person. And Brown and Levinson, who explored this, distinguished between positive and negative politeness. Positive politeness is making other people feel good in an explicit way. You have a lovely rousserie, or something like that. Negative politeness is what happens on an elevator when we separate. And we're trying to avoid stepping on other people's toes or getting in their space. Now, different cultures seem to value positive and negative politeness differently. So the Japanese, for example, are known for valuing negative politeness, from standing back, having linguistic forms that create distance between people so as not to step on them. Whereas in our culture, it seems easier to engage people and say nice things. And I think Americans are, mocked by British and others for thinking everything is great and terrific. So I think Taarof can express both the positive and the negative politeness. It's just kind of a framework that we can use to explore it. So how can non-native speakers interpret Taarof? So context is important. Taarof can be dense use of figurative language that may seem floral or meaningless to a non-native speaker. But the important thing we're saying here, it's not just something to be discarded till we move to the content, because we can learn about the relationship between the speakers, and we also need to learn more about Persian culture so we don't inappropriately apply American norms. If I say, that's a nice sweater, maybe in my culture we mean it, whereas in another culture it may just be a nice thing to say, But either culture could really, it's really a question of degree. And I guess you could do studies. But getting at what people really mean can be difficult because that would probably involve a psychologist. All languages deploy figurative language, and we talk about some figurative language as conventionalized. So that just means if I say I was petrified, that word originally meant, I turned to stone. But by convention, we use it to mean I'm frightened. So over time, certain expressions lose their literal or original meaning and become conventionalized figurative language. So what are the key points? That Taarof can mark differences in social status, which could either be deference to superiors or conferring favors to inferiors. So a big shot feels good when he can hand out stuff. And maybe I feel good showing deference to my superiors, so maybe I will get one of these favors one day. And then the idea of after you struggle to pay a bill or go in a door, and then for someone to accept the favor of either going in first or not is another thing that, and who does that can show the relative rank of the people in the society. And this is getting at negative politeness. Taarof provides a space for Persian speakers to avoid imposition and refrain from directly making requests and asking for favors. So that sounds like the negative politeness that I don't want to impinge upon my interlocutor. And one function of Taarof is to acknowledge and negotiate social relationships and status. So just to talk about some of the linguistics of this, the verb raftan means to go. And we would call that a neutral form. But if I want to lower myself before you, I could use another verb with the same meaning, ziyarat kardan, which literally means make a pilgrimage, but maybe in the particular case that I would use it, it doesn't mean a real religious pilgrimage. Or if I want to raise you or raise a third person, I could talk about tashrif bordan. And several verbs have these different varieties. So amadan, bechedmat residan, or tashrif avordan. Budan versus dar khedmat budan. Tashrif dashtan. So goftan, arz kardan. The first time I heard arz kardan, I didn't understand what the guy was talking about. But now I realize, he was talking to a superior, so he was lowering himself before her. And then farmudan, if you're the chief, you only order things. You don't really just say things. So a course that we would offer would go into more detail about these so students could identify who's lowering himself, who's raising the other, and so on. Then another interesting thing we encountered was, as I mentioned earlier, in Persian, to is the singular, and that's used informally, and shoma is plural and can be used formally. And I don't know what your experience is, but an American wrote a dissertation about the use of pronouns, and found that you could actually mix and match. So you could say shoma chubi, or I don't know if you could, but it says you couldn't say to chubid. And my experience in languages like French is you couldn't really do that kind of thing, tu parler or something like that. But in Persian, so the relative calibration of both the pronoun and the verb form can also indicate intermediate levels of familiarity or respect. Obviously, there's also geographical variation, and most of the literature we encountered was about Iranian Taarof. So I would certainly be interested in the Afghans' experience with Taarof to learn what kind of differences. I mean, we know that there are lexical differences, and because we're viewing the way people refer to others, whether it's to or shoma or with titles of respect, Hazrat Ali and so on, Ali, that's part of Taarof, the way we're looking at it. And so those kinds of terms might vary among the different varieties of Persian. So basically the challenges for non-native speakers are that Taarof can be too flowery and obscure the meaning, and it conveys more than a literal translation, as we've said. There's also potentially an increase in the level of difficulty because Taarof may, just as Proverbs, may use older forms of grammar and things like that that are not as familiar to the language learners. There may be special, syntax or sociocultural information conveyed by these phrases that the students would not necessarily have been exposed to. So another thing, of course, is that any language learner will bring the experience of his own culture when learning a second language. And so we think it's important, obviously, there's the high culture aspect of learning about the civilization of a place, but there's also the kind of basic culture that involves how people interact. That would also be important to communicate. And then how people express, their shared experiences and how they negotiate, whether it's paying a bill or going through a door or something more complicated like the nuclear negotiations. Are there actually aspects of Taarof that play into that? When is what my interlocutor is saying actually what he means or just something he's saying to be nice to me? And that may differ in different cultures. So understanding Taarof better by not ignoring it and by learning the different relationships with the people is important in order to interpret the entire situation that one is confronting. Things like family and friends, baten, and what's inside and outside, what's intimate and not, those also vary in different cultures. And the fact that people learning English, from Western Europe versus somebody from an indigenous culture in Latin America would have higher barriers to go through. I think this is the same thing here, that it's really a different cultural conceptualization that the students would need to be exposed to. So in summary, Taarof is more than a set of grammatical rules or expressions. It can be insincere or hypocritical, and we learned that Taarof echoshk is just one way of expressing that. But it can also, of course, be sincere because sometimes people really want to offer someone a place to stay, tea, a gift, or anything else. And Taarof is used to acknowledge and negotiate social relationships and relative status, and can provide critical information about the social standing of language users. And it requires a knowledge of how members of the group negotiate and conceptualize shared experiences as expressed through language. And first language, such as English, conceptualizations do not always carry over when engaging in Taarof. Thank you very much.